The strange but true story featured on this podcast contains details some people may find unsettling. Listener discretion is advised. I'm Chyaz Samuel, and things are about to get weird. Hello, you lovely lot, and welcome to this week's instalment of Things Are About to Get Weird. Every now and then, when I'm planning a new episode, I'll be taking a look at my list of ideas or having a general poke around the internet, and out of nowhere, some random flash of inspiration will hit me, and I'll think to myself, why have I never thought of covering that before? This episode was born of one of those moments. So today, I'm going to be talking to you about the endlessly intriguing and somewhat controversial topic of death row last meals, with a particular focus on cases from the US. So naturally, a warning right up front that this episode will involve brief mentions of executions, although I obviously won't linger on any gory details. Whilst, of course, I'll be giving you examples of some of the strangest last meal requests throughout the decades, I'm also going to be diving into the history, psychology, and debates around the practice. So let's just get right on into it. I think the concept of a condemned inmate being allowed to choose the food and drink they'd like for their final meal on Earth has taken on an identity of its own over the years. It's no longer simply a step in the process of a person on death row eventually being executed. It's become everything from a hypothetical icebreaker question at dinner parties to the subject of both photography exhibitions and endless online articles, all with a variation of the headline, "Here are what 10 death row inmates chose for their last meal." And yes, I tend to click on them every time. For the record, I don't personally believe in the death penalty. The idea of state-sanctioned killing has always been completely bizarre to me, and I think there's a huge difference between enjoying a topic and being interested by a topic, and I'm firmly in the latter camp. Anyway, I realised that there are always certain questions that I'm left with after reading one of these articles, like how did the idea of the last meal come to be, and what's the history behind this seemingly merciful tradition that takes place so soon before something that many would argue is utterly barbaric. It's trickier than you might think to find an answer to this, but in my search I stumbled across a gripping research paper by Sarah Gerwig-Moore from the Mercer University in the US state of Georgia, and what I learned from the paper might just surprise you. It explained that whilst many have long held the belief that the practice was inspired by the story of Jesus and the Last Supper, at least in some countries, this may not be true at all. In the paper, Sarah cites a quote from Max Bigert, co-producer of a Swedish documentary called Last Supper, which indicates that the origins may actually lie in a belief of the paranormal. It states that the tradition, quote, can be traced back to pre-Christian times to the fear of ghosts. In ancient Greece, you had to feed the person who was going to be executed so that they could cross the river Styx into the underworld and not come back as a hungry ghost. I couldn't believe what I was reading when I first saw this. It has officially become the number one interesting fact that I'm going to keep in my back pocket. And whilst we might automatically think of the US when we picture death row and last meals, the history of the tradition is far more widespread. For example, in 18th century Germany, a prisoner facing execution would have what was called a hangman's meal. This wouldn't just be a solitary dinner eaten in the privacy of their own cell, but was instead a much larger affair, which could also include holding a final communion. It would be attended by everyone from clergy members to local dignitaries, and even the hangman himself, hence the name. That is one of the strangest things I've ever heard, but it only gets weirder, because it actually became a custom in Germany to serve the condemned inmate an entire roast goose as part of this ritual, which makes some of the examples of meals I'll be telling you about later on look like a mere snack. During this same time in London, the tradition was a very British matter indeed, as it would often involve a visit to the pub. And yes, I did just say the pub. The research paper states that the night before their execution, certain prisoners were allowed to mix with those on the outside. Then, on the day itself, quote, the procession would stop at a pub for the condemned's customary great bowl of ale to drink at their pleasure, as their last refreshment in life. When you find out about these aspects of the history of the last meal, you really get the sense that it was kind of seen as a last hurrah. I mean, the feasts and pub visits of the 18th century make even the most extravagant 21st century requests look tame. I'm actually going to be revisiting this point in a little bit, because in more recent times, there's been quite the debate around the choice aspect of the last meal in certain states across the pond. And whilst we're speaking about the US, the reason I've chosen to focus on US death row cases for this episode isn't because other countries with the death penalty don't subscribe to the concept of the last meal, or at least some variation of it. It's just that there is nowhere near as much information available about those countries, so it's very difficult to say for sure. The Amnesty International 2022 report noted that several countries actually have much higher execution rates than the US. But when you try to look into the specific aspects of these cases, like last meals for example, there's almost nothing to go on. There is a lot of secrecy involved. But the US happens to be much more open with this information. And that leads us neatly onto the question of why this topic holds so much fascination for people. Be honest, have you ever thought about what your death row last meal would be? It's a pretty macabre question, and some would argue that it's perhaps even insensitive. But I bet that more than a few of us have our answers ready to go. But don't worry, it doesn't mean that we're the bad kind of weird. It seems it may be much more a matter of human nature. One person who has made his fascination with death row last meals part of his life's work is New Zealand-born photographer Henry Hargreaves. In 2013, Henry exhibited a photography series based on these meal choices, with the ominous title, No Seconds. He would set up recreations of real last meals chosen by death row inmates and photograph them from above, with this perspective meant to mimic what the prisoner would have seen through their own eyes while sitting down for their final dinner. And when asked about his interest in last meals, he's quoted in The Independent as saying, "For me, the death penalty was no longer an abstract thing. The detail of death row meals brought home the human aspect. I thought, if I can empathise with these people through their last meals, other people can too." And although I'm no psychologist, this does make a lot of sense to me. I think as humans, we naturally want to understand other humans. So when we see these people on death row who have committed these terrible crimes that we can't get our heads around, we may feel that there's very little we could possibly ever have in common with them. It's almost as though we're meant to view them as monsters instead of people. But if we then get to see the items they've picked as the very last things they get to consume in their life, and say the brand and type of drink they choose is the same one we would choose, it means that the briefest and smallest of connections is then present. Don't get me wrong, it's not that we want to have things in common with serial killers or other serious criminals, but perhaps it's that if we have something to go off to humanize them, maybe some of our other questions about them or their situation could be answered. Or maybe the reason that we're so fascinated is because no matter how many times we give a hypothetical answer to this question when it comes up in casual conversation, it's not something that the overwhelming majority of people would ever have to answer for real. But some of those on death row do. Of course, that's going to be interesting to us. Alternatively, according to capital punishment expert Professor Deborah Deno, maybe it's that, quote, "It brings us back to the fact that this is a human being who will not be having any more dinners like we do." Or because, as she added, there's a drama associated with it. This is the Last Supper. But perhaps it's something else entirely. Maybe the real reason we're so interested by the death row last meal is because it's arguably the most palatable part of this controversial topic to think about. Say there's a person who has been convicted of awful, unthinkable crimes, was sentenced to death, and the execution had been carried out. The details of their crimes would likely be hard to hear, and especially if you're someone who doesn't believe in the death penalty, like myself, you probably don't want to learn about the specifics of their execution either. But the last meal is something that even the most squeamish or true crime averse amongst us could deal with hearing about. Journalist Tony Caron wrote a piece for Time magazine back in the year 2000 about the topic, and parts of his piece echoed this same sentiment. For example, he wrote, "Perhaps our culture has evolved this ritual of the la carte last meal to sugarcoat what remains a grim act of violence by the state to redress a previous wrong." The Virginia death penalty lawyer John Sheldon has also shared his views on the tradition, and his thoughts seem to be along a similar line too. In a BBC article, it notes that he believes, as a ritual, the last meal is intended not to comfort the condemned, but to soften for society the harsh fact that a human is about to be killed with the law's full sanction. So by these reasonings, it makes sense why we're so interested. Maybe it's been designed that way. Maybe that's why the US death penalty states are so forthcoming and open with this information, because in a warped kind of way, it's seen as good PR, until it isn't, of course, as we'll find out later on in this episode when we talk about the infamous Lawrence Brewer case. But all of that said, and whichever aspect of psychology could explain our preoccupation with death row last meals, the fact remains that many of us can't help but be fascinated by the subject, especially when the condemned prisoner chooses something out of the ordinary. So here are just a few examples of the last meals that have captured the public's attention over the decades. Arguably one of the most infamous is the dinner chosen by serial killer John Wayne Gacy, also known as the Killer Clown, who was found guilty of multiple crimes including 33 counts of murder. The meal consisted of 12 fried shrimp, a portion of French fries, a bucket of original recipe Kentucky Fried Chicken, and a pound of fresh strawberries. Now, at first glance, this doesn't seem particularly interesting. I mean, that's a lot of strawberries, but otherwise it's not outrageous. Until you consider that before he was charged for his crimes, Gacy had been the manager at 3 different KFC branches. This link back to his life as a free man was something the public found so intriguing. Was he trying to relive a different time in his life with this last meal pick? Maybe find some comfort in the familiar? Was he trying to be intentionally creepy or even quirky with the request? Or did he just really like KFC? These same kinds of questions were applied to the last meal choice of another shockingly prolific US killer, the Oklahoma City bomber Timothy McVeigh, whose deliberate actions ended the lives of at least 168 people. For his last meal, McVeigh opted for 2 whole pints of mint chocolate chip ice cream, and that's it. It's often been pointed out how juvenile the request was, almost like he was trying to live out a childhood dream in his final hours. Then we had Ricky Ray Rector, who was sentenced to death after being found guilty of 2 counts of murder. He picked a meal of steak, fried chicken, cherry Kool-Aid, and a piece of pecan pie. But it's said that he ended up leaving the dessert, telling a guard that he was, quote, saving it for later. Whilst this may seem like some form of gallows humour at first, the truth was that Rector was an individual with a very low IQ and was living with a severe brain injury, which arguably raises much deeper questions around the fact he was on death row in the first place. But I digress. Some, like Ronnie Lee Gardner, had an extra request in addition to their food. Whilst he asked to eat a dinner of steak, lobster tail, apple pie and vanilla ice cream, he wanted to do so whilst watching the Lord of the Rings trilogy, which he was allowed to do. Others had requests which were just plain strange. For example, Victor Figa, who was executed in 1963, requested a single olive with the pit still in it. It's thought that he did this in the hope that after his death, an olive tree might grow where he was buried, though some reports suggest it was him expressing his last wish, which was for world peace. And then, of course, there were others who requested absolutely nothing at all. These inmates include Angel Nieves Diaz, who was instead offered the standard prison dinner, but again refused to eat it. Now, the more I read about all of these real-life death row last meal examples, the more questions started popping up in my mind, not just about the process of this tradition, but about the psychology behind the prisoners' choices too. And after doing some further research, I discovered so many interesting facts and theories, so let me lay some of them out for you. First of all, one of the most highly researched aspects of the death row last meal is something I hinted at when telling you about some of the notable examples, and it's around why a prisoner might choose certain foods for their final dinner. A 2012 paper by researchers at Cornell University, which analysed the last meal requests of 247 death row inmates in the US over a 5-year period, determined some fascinating truths. Most people chose a meal that was calorically dense, at an average of around 2,756 calories. The meals were typically very high in protein and fat and were comprised mostly of items like meat products, fried foods, desserts, and fizzy drinks. Essentially, what the research found was that these choices matched up with what other studies have previously found, which is that these higher fat, calorie-dense foods are often used by people to help, quote, mediate feelings of stress or distress. Very interesting indeed. Psychiatrist Dr. Raj Prasad wrote an article for Psychology Today where he added to this, noting that it's a well-known fact that those facing a reminder of their own mortality do tend to eat more. He also pointed out that in the 2012 study, almost 40% of the inmates requested branded food or drinks, and suggests that this could be because they were searching for some kind of comfort in the familiar. If they had grown up always drinking a certain brand of soft drinks or eating from a particular fast food restaurant, it makes sense that they might try to seek it out one last time. But one aspect that, in a way, I found even more intriguing than what food items people chose is when someone wouldn't choose food at all, but instead use their last meal request to make some kind of statement. After all, death row prisoners know that the details of their final meal picks are going to be reported in the media either just before or after they're executed, and it's believed that some might use this to their advantage in a weird sort of way. Take the case of Robert Madden, who was convicted of the murders of 2 men, but never wavered in his denial of the crimes, claiming he was 100% not guilty. He requested that instead of receiving food for his last meal, that a dinner be donated to a homeless person instead. Could this have been Madden's way of trying to showcase that he really was a good and innocent person from beyond the grave? Or was he really guilty but in denial about the fact, and therefore didn't want to participate in any part of the process leading up to his execution? We'll likely never know, but it's definitely something that's still referenced and debated to this day, and there has actually been formal research done into this idea. In a 2014 paper by Brian Wansink and Kevin Niffin, it was found that inmates who denied their guilt until the very end were far more likely to order nothing at all for their final meal than those who used their last words to admit their guilt, express regret, regret or apologize to their victims. The study also showed that of those who claimed innocence but did still choose a last meal, it was often lower in calories and featured fewer branded items too. It was suggested that this could be because the prisoner maintaining their innocence didn't want to accept the olive branch that the last meal symbolizes. Why would they if they didn't commit the crime they're being executed for? And by that same logic, those who admitted their guilt were possibly more at peace with their fate, as far as a person could be anyway. So they were therefore more likely to participate in the ritual of the last meal. As someone who doesn't believe in the death penalty, partly because of the chance that an innocent person could mistakenly be killed for a crime they didn't commit, I found all of this incredibly compelling. So, after everything I'd learned up until this point, I then started wondering about the rules around what a death row inmate is allowed to choose. Can they pick whatever they want with no limits? Or are there certain restrictions in place? Well, as with many issues in the US, it looks like it largely varies between states. And this is because the last meal is actually a tradition and not a right. So, for example, in Oklahoma, prisoners can choose what they want, but they have a $25 spending limit. Whilst in Florida, that limit is $40, but the food has to be available from the local area. From what I could find, I think that in almost all death penalty states and under all circumstances, prisoners are prohibited from choosing alcohol as their last meal drink, which could be why so many opt for something like a fizzy drink instead. In Texas, however, death row inmates have not been allowed to pick the contents of their last meal at all since back in 2011. And here we get to the case I referred to earlier, that of Lawrence Brewer. Now, it's safe to say that Brewer was a truly despicable person. He was a white supremacist from Texas who murdered a black man named James Byrd Jr. in the most heinous and inhumane manner imaginable. It's actually so gruesome and upsetting that I'm not going to go into further details about it today. But for his part in James's murder, for which he showed no remorse, Brewer was sentenced to death, and when the date of his execution drew nearer in 2011, he was asked to choose what he wanted for his last meal. When reporting what the killer picked, the BBC noted, just before the acknowledged white supremacist was put to death by lethal injection on Wednesday, he ordered 2 steaks, a triple meat cheeseburger, a cheese omelette, a large bowl of fried okra, 3 fajitas, a pint of ice cream, and a pound of barbecue meat. It's not clear how much of that he was actually served or whether his nerves affected his appetite, but he ate none of it. I've also read that he reportedly asked for multiple cans of root beer in addition to the food he requested too. Now, when the news that Brewer had not actually consumed the large final meal he had requested got out, there was uproar amongst some key Texan political figures. State Senator John Whitmire openly called for the tradition of the last meal to be brought to an end in the state, saying, "It is extremely inappropriate to give a person sentenced to death such a privilege." And just the next day, the Texas Department of Criminal Justice decided that they agreed. The senator was very blunt in his reasoning, making it clear that despite the waste of the lavish meal making headlines, it was actually a moral issue for him rather than a financial one. Speaking about the matter, he said, "If you're fixing to execute someone under the laws of the state because of the hideous crime that someone has committed, I'm not looking to comfort him. He didn't give his victim any comfort or a choice of last meal." And from this point, an entire widespread conversation was then prompted. Some, like the Virginia death penalty lawyer John Sheldon, who I mentioned earlier, spoke out about a different aspect of the debate, saying that, quote, "I don't know anybody who has eaten the last meal. In my experience, hence it is unlikely that someone is going to be hungry and is going to want a meal. It's either not ordered or it's ordered and it's not eaten, implying that Brewer's behaviour was understandable and that the tradition coming to a stop wouldn't have much of an impact anyway. But amongst the voices piping up to join the debate about the availability of a personalised final meal for death row inmates, there were also those who took the opportunity to speak about the wider issues related to capital punishment too. Richard Dieter, the executive director of the Death Penalty Information Center, which is a US non-profit research organization, was one of them. He took the opportunity to point out that there were far bigger issues with the quote, justice, efficacy, and constitutionality of capital punishment than there were with the tradition of the last meal. He added, they take it away, hopefully they're looking to what they should be providing. A last lawyer rather than a last meal is much more important. But to add an even more curious angle to this debate, some death row inmates themselves started adding their thoughts to the public discussion. Convicted killer Ron Hamilton, who is still on death row in Texas to this day and has been since the early 2000s, has stated that he doesn't want a last meal at all, saying, quote, I don't eat with my enemies, which of course made me think back to the history section of our episode and the practices that were common in parts of Europe in the 18th century. Hamilton instead echoed the thoughts of some death row prisoners that have come before him, saying that he'd much rather be able to hug his mother than pick his final dinner. But I have a feeling that for those in power who opposed the ritual of the last meal, anything that would look like an act of mercy for a prisoner facing execution is probably going to be a no-go. Although many of the cases I've mentioned today, including the Brewer controversy, are from several years back now, don't think that the subject of the last meal has left the news cycle in more recent times, because that could not be further from the truth. Just last month, numerous news publications from around the world reported that a convicted double murderer, Stacey Humphreys, had received his execution date in the state of Georgia. And in their stories, almost all of the news outlets began by focusing entirely on what Humphreys had chosen for his last meal over any other details of the case, especially in their headlines. And it wasn't just the more lowbrow publications opting for the sensational angle, highlighting the large quantity of food he asked for. Even the Independent's headline read, Last meal request for Georgia killer set for execution includes meat lovers pan pizza and cornbread. Whilst the killer's victims, Cynthia Williams and Lori Brown, were mentioned quite early on in the Independence piece, the same can't be said for others. For example, the New York Post article on the story featured every detail of Humphrey's requested meal, along with his height and weight, and even the fact that according to his BMI he's clinically obese, before they finally got around to naming Cynthia and Lori. I really wasn't exaggerating when I said that the last meal has taken on an identity of its own over the years. Even in 2026, the public fascination with it seems to be as strong as ever. So, after spending countless hours reading about death row last meals, what are some of the thoughts that I've been left with? Well, I was genuinely surprised to learn just how controversial this topic really is. I think over the past couple of decades, it's become almost as much of a talking point as the existence of the death penalty itself. It's also left me wondering just how many of the famous or infamous last meals that have been recreated and photographed for numerous art exhibitions were actually even consumed by the prisoner in their final hours, whether because of nerves or by way of a protest. And ultimately, I've started to think that whilst the subject remains utterly fascinating from a human nature perspective, I've also started to understand why some argue that the tradition itself is, in reality, bordering on the futile. The journalist Tony Caron wrote something in his piece for Time magazine that I found very thought-provoking, and I wanted to share it as we round things off for today. He wrote, "Whether we allow a man carte blanche with junk food menus and then have a medic administer a lethal injection, or we simply serve him that day's fried chicken and then shoot him in the head, the act is, in essence, the same. The difference in the end may have less to do with the condemned man's perception than it does with the way his executioners and the society that orders them to kill its capital convicts experience his death." But whatever your personal opinions on these divisive subjects are, I hope that this episode has given you plenty to think about, along with a whole host of intriguing facts to share the next time you find yourself on the receiving end of the question, what would your death row last meal be? Oh my gosh, when I first started putting this episode together, I had no idea just how much of a head scratcher it would end up being. There were so many points during my research where I found myself just sitting there having debates with myself in my own head about the complexities of this subject. It's honestly one that I don't think I'll ever look at in quite the same way again. What do you think about this one? Did you come into this episode with any particular thoughts or feelings that have perhaps shifted a little? Do you have your death row last meal answers ready to go, even though you know it's totally hypothetical? I feel like all I want to do is sit around an enormous wooden table with you all and carry on this conversation for hours to come. But in the absence of that possibility, I would really love to read your takes on this topic. Feel free to leave a comment if you're listening or watching on Spotify today, or get in touch via social media. I would love to know what you make of it all. But just before I let you go today, we still have time for our trusty outro feature. So without further ado, here is Weird Media. Now, when I decided on this week's Weird Media shout-out, I had to seriously think about whether I'd already mentioned it in the feature. And as soon as I realised I hadn't, I knew I had to rectify that straight away. So, back in November, I went to the Uncanny Fear of the Dark live show at the amazing Theatr Clwyd in North Wales, and it was absolutely sensational. If you're not familiar with Uncanny, it's a podcast/radio show/TV series created by Danny Robbins, and it's dedicated to stories of strange experiences. Danny interviews guests about their odd encounters with ghosts or UFOs or other unexplained forces, and experts on either Team Skeptic or Team Believer weigh in on the cases. Now, going along to the live show, I wasn't entirely sure what to expect, but it was brilliant. Danny was joined on stage by experts Kieran O'Keefe and Evelyn Hollow, and they explored a number of cases from all kinds of angles. I don't want to give anything much away as the tour is still running, but there was also some fascinating audience participation and super engaging visual aspects to the show. And it was actually so good that myself and my spooky crew, who I went with the first time, are going back to watch it again. I was also lucky enough to run into two of our absolutely lovely listeners in the interval, who could not have been more sweet and kind. So a big hello to Vicky and Siobhan. It was absolutely wonderful to meet you both. What I loved about the Uncanny show was that it was quite theatrical in parts, but it still had this really relatable heart to it. It was spooky, funny, tense, and surprising. Basically, I think they just nailed the format, and I'm already excited to experience it all over again. Thank you all so much for joining me on the podcast today. I hope you found our main story as interesting as I did. Shout outs to all of the sources I used during my research will be in the show notes or description box, complete with links if you'd like to do any further reading for yourselves. I'll also be listing all of our social media pages and our email address for you too. I genuinely love to hear your thoughts on everything we discuss on the show, so if you'd like to get in touch on Instagram, Threads, Facebook, or even TikTok, it's never been easier to do so. If you've enjoyed this episode and have a spare moment before you head off today, I am always so appreciative of a quick rating or review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. And if you're watching on YouTube, please feel free to subscribe and give this video a little thumbs up. Thanks again for tuning in to Things Are About to Get Weird, and I hope you all have a fantastic rest of the week. I'll be back very soon indeed with more tales of the strange and unusual. So, until next time, take care of yourself and others and keep it weird, but the good kind of weird.